So hello and welcome everyone to State of Eight, Presidential Leadership Forged in Ohio. My name is Joshua Dubert. I am the historian at the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Library and Museums in Fremont, Ohio. And I'm thrilled to have this opportunity to moderate tonight's program. This is the last of our State of Eight series on two of Ohio's presidents. Tonight's going to be William McKinley and William Howard Taft. So each presenter will discuss how the presidents shaped and were shaped by events of their eras, which impacted their presidential terms and American history. Participants will hear the personal stories of these leaders and their families in and out of the White House. Additionally, both presenters will connect the discussion to America 250 Ohio's theme for March, which is music and entertainment. There will be time for questions at the end of each program. And so a quick side note, I do want to remind our presenters that we have a pretty sharp 1 hour time limit we have to adhere to in order to facilitate the Q&A. So the program will be split into two 30-minute presentations. And now to introduce this evening's first presenter, Kim Kenney, who will be speaking on William McKinley. So Kim Kenney joined the staff of the McKinley Presidential Library and Museum as curator in 2001 and was promoted to executive director in 2019. She is the author of 9 books, including Exploring the American Presidency Through 50 Historic Treasures. And with that, Kim, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. So just to give you a little, to kind of orient you to where we are in Canton, our museum is a little bit different from a lot of other presidential museums. We have a science center and a planetarium and a lot of other things. We do have a gallery that is dedicated to McKinley and his life, but we are the final resting place for McKinley, for his wife Ida, and their 2 young daughters. And that's kind of how we're situated. So I like to show this picture of the monument because those are people on the steps, and it shows you exactly how large it is. There are 108 steps to get up to the top. And that door is enormous, and we don't, if you haven't been here before, you wouldn't really kind of situate yourself and understand that it's this really, it rivals anything that you'll see in Washington, D.C. So we'll start at the beginning with McKinley's early life. So he was born in Niles, Ohio, in 1843. His family moved to Poland when he was about 9 years old. In 1859, he went to Allegheny College, but he dropped out in his first year. And we aren't sure if he dropped out for health reasons, if it was a mental health reason. But by the time he was ready to go back to school, he didn't have the financial support from his family. And so he didn't finish college. He instead taught Sunday school. He worked as an assistant postmaster, and he was also a teacher in a one-room schoolhouse. But in 1861, he was 18 years old, and he immediately wanted to join the Union Army. His mother didn't want him to join, but he felt that it was his duty to do that. And I want to thank Josh and the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Library and Museums for the picture of Hayes on the right. So this is what those 2 men looked like when they were in the Civil War together in the 23rd OVI, Ohio Volunteer Infantry. And McKinley was promoted to a commissary sergeant in 1862. And Rutherford B. Hayes once wrote about his career saying, "Young as he was, we soon found that in business and executive ability, young McKinley was a man of rare capacity, of unusual and unsurpassed capacity, especially for a boy of his age. When battles were fought or service was to be performed in warlike things, he always took his place. The night was never too dark, the weather was never too cold, there was no sleet or storm or hail or snow or rain that was in the way of his prompt and efficient performance of every duty. At once it was found that he had unusual character for the mere business of war." So while he was in the Civil War, he participated in 2 major battles, the Battle of South Mountain and the Battle of Antietam, which was one of the bloodiest battles of the war. So during that battle, McKinley gathered up some stragglers who had made their way back to camp, and he loaded up 2 wagons with coffee and hardtack, and he started off to the front lines. So several times he was ordered to fall back. He ignored those orders, and he delivered supplies to the weary soldiers at the front. So many years later, his political opponents would refer to him as Coffee Bill, as a derogatory nickname, to sort of minimize his actions during the war. But he was always very proud of his service. And in fact, he preferred to be called the Major even over being called President. So when the war was over, he attended Albany Law School, and I always think that's not how it works today. You know, he didn't finish college, but he went ahead and attended law school. So you could do that back then. So he went to the Albany School of Law, and he was looking for some place to start his career as a young lawyer. And his sister, Anna, who's on the right, she had already relocated to Canton. Other family members had come to Canton. Their parents were here, and she suggested that McKinley settle here because there was a lot of work for a new lawyer. The town was growing. And I always like to point out with this picture, a couple years ago, we put it out on Facebook, and somebody actually called our president a tasty snack, which people don't really think about that with McKinley, but this picture is a young, attractive man that he was when he moved to Canton. So he originally became the law partner of George Belden, but after Belden died, he practiced law on his own. And you can see in the blow up in the corner, William McKinley, attorney at law. So he had his law office directly across the street from the courthouse in downtown Canton. So he soon caught the eye of the young belle of Canton, Ida Saxton. They originally met at a picnic, but there were no sparks for either of them at that time. Ida went off to take the grand tour of Europe with her sister, and when she returned in December of 1869, she resumed her position as a teller in her father's bank. So Ida was a working girl. And one day McKinley came into the bank, and this time they were much more interested in each other, and they ended up getting married on January 25th of 1871. This is their wedding invitation. It was a Wednesday evening. We don't have the concept of weekend weddings and, getting married on Saturday or Sunday. They got married on a Wednesday night. And in a letter inviting General and Mrs. Hayes to the wedding, he wrote, "Miss S is everything I could hope for." So there were 700 people who attended the wedding. And we also have in our collection their marriage license, which is signed by William McKinley. And he would use the junior until his father died, and then he dropped the junior. So on Christmas Day of 1871, their first daughter, Katie, was born. And a second baby, named after her mother, was born on April 1st, 1873. So sadly, both of the girls did not survive. Baby Ida died at 4 months old on August 22nd of 1873, and then Catherine, or Katie, was 3.5 when she died in June of 1875. So they were buried in West Lawn Cemetery, which is right next door to our property. There was a family plot where all the McKinley relatives were buried, and that's probably where William McKinley expected to be, but that is not what happened. So after the deaths of their children, and then Ida's grandfather and then her mother in very close succession, it took a toll on her mental and physical health. And recent scholarship has shown she wasn't an invalid, as some older historians and other time periods have said. She wasn't bedbound the entire time. She wasn't as active as a first lady, but she certainly wasn't incapable of doing that role. So in spite of all these personal setbacks, McKinley really is thriving in his professional life. So he served as Stark County prosecutor from 1869 to 1871. He was elected to Congress in 1876. He would go on to serve 10 terms. There was one break in 1884 when his district was redrawn and he lost that election, and then he won the one following that. And in 1891, he became governor of Ohio. And if you've been to the State House, there is a statue to him, and it is on the spot, allegedly, where McKinley would turn every day when he was on his way to the State House to turn and wave to Ida, who would be in the window of their home in the Neal House that was across the street from the State House. So when we talk about McKinley, there's so many things that, lots of other presidents have lots of scandals. There really isn't a whole lot to talk about with William McKinley. And there's one incident that could be termed a scandal. So on February 17th, 1893, he's on a train headed for New York City. And when the train stops in Buffalo, this is a different time he was in Buffalo, he received a telegram that his lifelong friend from Poland, his name was Robert Walker, had gone bankrupt. And McKinley suddenly remembered that he had given this very trusted friend a number of blank signed promissory notes. So he soon found himself in debt for over $100,000 in 1893. And he thought for sure this was going to end his political career. He vowed to repay every cent. Ida had some family property and her inheritance she was willing to liquidate to help him cover this. But in the end, his friends and his political connections that he'd spent his lifetime making really came to his rescue. So a Canton man named Myron Herrick and then Cleveland businessman Mark Hanna started a special fund to help him repay his debts, and they paid off every single penny. And McKinley asked for a list of donors so that he could thank them, and he eventually wanted to repay them, but he was never given a list. So literally the biggest scandal that we have is that this guy was too nice and too trusting of a lifelong friend. And he got in a little bit of trouble, but his friends then got him out of it. So the front porch campaign that McKinley ran, there are 4 Ohio presidents that did front porch campaigns. You've already heard about 3 of them. But in those days, there were no primaries. And so candidates were selected at the convention. So at the 1896 Republican convention was held in St. Louis, and McKinley got the nomination on the first ballot. So there was a threshold of votes you had to get. And if you didn't get up to that, there was many, many ballots. But this time there was just one. So why did McKinley want to campaign from his front porch? Well, Ida's health is certainly a factor. He didn't want to leave her for long periods of time. But the other reason is that William Jennings Bryan that he ran against was a better orator, and McKinley knew it. He was also a lot younger. McKinley was 53 at the time, but Bryan was only 36. And so Bryan is crisscrossing the country, giving all kinds of speeches. A lot of times, the train is literally just stopping, as you see in this cartoon, and he's speaking from the back of the train. And so a little bit of statistics on how many words this man is speaking. 80,000 words a day. So the average person speaks about 140 words per minute. So we know that means about 571 minutes per day he's speaking, which is 9.5 hours. So that's how much Bryan is speaking. So in sharp contrast to that, McKinley is doing all this from his house. So sometimes there's a big crowd like you see in this picture. Other times the delegations are smaller. But this type of campaigning really speaks to his strengths. It frames him as calm, he's stable, he's presidential, and it allows him to control the narrative, which is a very powerful thing because the campaign, there's a whole story about the campaign, but basically it boils down to McKinley is in control and his campaign managers are in control of everything that happened. So 750,000 people ended up coming to Canton during that election season. And McKinley thought that tariffs were going to be the main concern and main issue of the campaign. But it turns out it was the gold standard. So this becomes kind of the primary thing that everybody is talking about during this campaign. So the difference between the gold standard, which McKinley is for, and the free coinage of silver, which the Democrats and William Jennings Bryan is for, are that the gold standard, or the gold bugs that they called themselves, they wanted every dollar backed by 100 cents of gold. They believed this would make a stable, strong currency. It would maintain confidence. It would keep inflation low. That was supported by big business and banks and the industrial Northeast. On the other side, the free coinage of silver would mean that every dollar would be backed by silver at a fixed ratio of 16-1. It would increase the money supply, they believed. Intentional inflation would help debtors by making it easier to pay off loans, and that would be supported by farmers and laborers. So in the end, McKinley won. He got 61% of the electoral votes, or 51.1% of the popular vote. So in his first term, this is one of my favorite documents in our collection. I know many of you have probably seen city directories. This is a page from the Canton City Directory on the left. So the next one that comes out after his election updates his profession to be President of the United States. So, there's a carpenter above and below him, there's painters, other people, there's a widow, but he's President of the United States, and that is how he's listed. So McKinley does return to tariffs, and you may have heard a little bit about that in the news in the past, year and a half or so. And this was really in response to an economic slump that happened in the 1890s. So this gentleman is Mr. Dingley, and Nelson Dingley, and he's the person in Congress that McKinley worked with to get the tariff bill passed. So this act significantly increased duties. I think everybody understands what tariffs are now on imports, including things like wool, steel, sugar, luxury items. And the intention was to shield American companies from foreign competition. What actually tends to happen is that these high rates cause immediate increases in import costs, which impacts supply chain things like construction materials and certain consumer goods. It also allows you to charge more for domestic goods just below what a tariff imposed good from a foreign market would be. So it tends to make everything a little bit more expensive. So one of the greatest challenges that McKinley faced in his first term as president was the decision to go to war with Spain. So there had been an ongoing conflict between Cuba and Spain, and McKinley, having seen the horrors of war up close, was not interested in getting the United States into a war, that wasn't something that he thought that he really believed in. He was very reluctant to send troops. And in January of 1898, he sent the USS Maine to Havana Harbor to both protect American citizens and property, but also to demonstrate that the United States still valued Spain's friendship. So the ship explodes in February of 1898. It killed 266 crew members. McKinley immediately ordered an investigation, and the rallying cry, "Remember the Maine," is everywhere. It's in all the newspapers. Some of the yellow journalism at the time had been kind of stirring up sentiment against Spain to go to war with Cuba, and this was sort of the last straw. And then the public starts to, this rallying cry, "Remember the Maine," becomes a very popular thing, and it grows louder and louder. The Navy concluded that it was likely a Spanish mine that destroyed the ship, but modern investigations suggest that it could have been an accident. But at the time, McKinley believed, as many people did, that it was because of Spain, and so we ended up going to war. 400 Americans died. Most of those were, besides the 266 that died in the explosion. Most of the 400 people who died actually succumbed to illness like malaria, yellow fever, those types of things, rather than combat. So it's a very short war. It only lasts a few short weeks. And the Treaty of Paris eventually is signed. Hostilities end, and then the Treaty of Paris is signed in December. And in that treaty, Spain gave up its colonies of Guam, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. The United States emerged, for better or worse, as a global superpower for the first time, and that's going to shape our foreign policy throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century. So this marks the end of centuries of colonizing efforts in Spain. This actually leads to a renaissance in Spain, actually, in Spanish culture, as they start to look inward instead of looking at this empire across the world. And then we end up, for the first time, with colonies ourselves. We don't call them that, we call them territories, but it's the first time that we have kind of entered this global stage. So believe it or not, there is actually a natural transition between the Spanish-American War and the March theme for America 250 Ohio of music and entertainment. And that is that the Admiral Dewey March was written in 1899 by John Philip Sousa to commemorate the victory in the Spanish-American War. And it was actually played at the first Valentine dance that was ever held at the White House in 1901. So the Marine Band was stationed just inside the doors of the old greenhouses, which is where the West Wing is today. which opened into the state dining room. And that was the first song that they played was the Admiral Dewey March. So the cover on the right for the Ladies' Home Journal, that shows Ida sitting in those old greenhouses or conservatory, as they were called. There were also many other distinguished performers at the White House, including the soprano Ciceretta Jones on the left, violinist Joseph Douglas, who is the grandson of Frederick Douglass. And there was a composer and cellist named Ernest Lent who played for the president and Mrs. McKinley, and 70 guests after a dinner for the Supreme Court in 1898. And that set the precedent for the state dinner format of having dinner and then musical entertainment. So McKinley was actually the first administration to do that. Mrs. McKinley enjoyed playing the piano. There were several pianos in the White House during the administration, including this Kimball grand piano, which is now in the McKinley Gallery in our museum. And during that time, ragtime is becoming very popular, and the McKinleys actually really loved ragtime, including things that were composed by this gentleman, which is Scott Joplin. So McKinley's second term, during the first term, his first vice president, Garrett Hobart, died, and he died in 1899, and we simply did not replace him. This is actually really common. The vice presidency is vacant 16 times for a total of more than 37 years before the 25th Amendment is ratified in 1967, which provides a formalized presidential succession plan after Kennedy's assassination. If McKinley had also died during his first term, but after Hobart had died, Secretary of State John Hay would have become president, and that was the problem. It had to be formalized in a different way because cabinet positions are not elected, so that didn't feel very American, and so that 25th Amendment goes down through some elected positions instead of appointed ones. But I love this Photoshop, so we just don't take another picture of McKinley. We just put Teddy Roosevelt, substitute Garrett Hobart for Teddy Roosevelt. So McKinley doesn't think that campaigning is very presidential. He sends Teddy out to do some of it. The party does it also, but he does not campaign. He stays in Washington doing his job, and he wins again. Again, he ran against William Jennings Bryan. So McKinley's thoughts are beginning to change. And on the night before his assassination, he's at the Pan American Exposition, and he gives what would become his final speech. And I want to read a little bit from the speech to show his thinking changing from the tariff idea to something else. So part of what he said is, our capacity to produce has developed so enormously and our products have so multiplied that the problem of more markets requires our urgent and immediate attention. Only a broad and enlightened policy will keep what we have. By sensible trade arrangements which will not interrupt our home production, we shall extend the outlets for our increasing surplus. A system which provides a mutual exchange of commodities is manifestly essential to the continued and healthful growth of our export trade. We must not repose in the fancied security that we can forever sell everything and buy little or nothing. Reciprocity is the natural outgrowth of our wonderful industrial development under the domestic policy now firmly established. The period of exclusiveness is past. The expansion of our trade and commerce is the pressing problem. Commercial wars are unprofitable. A policy of goodwill and friendly trade relations will prevent reprisals. Reciprocity treaties are in harmony with the spirit of the times. Measures of retaliation are not. So incidentally, this photograph on the left was taken by a photojournalist named Frances Benjamin Johnston. We currently have an exhibit about her work until the end of May. And she took this picture as the final speech. And then the statue on the steps outside of our museum is based on that statue. So the next day after this speech, he's heading by carriage to the Temple of Music. This is the last picture that Frances Benjamin Johnston took of him. There was one more photographer that was closer to the Temple of Music, so she isn't the final photograph. She's minutes from being the final photograph. But what I love about this is that he's looking directly in the camera. He's tipping his hat to her, and it kind of shows this intimate moment between a photographer that had covered him since the beginning and is about to you know, like the world be shocked by what happens next. So he is shaking hands at the Temple of Music, greeting the public, and there's a person that approaches with a bandage on his right hand. McKinley reaches instead for his left hand to shake his hand, and the assassin, Leon Czolgosz, fires 2 shots point blank range into the president. This was September 6th, and 8 days later, he would die. So he was laid in state in Buffalo for a little while. Then he went by train to Washington, D.C., and he was in the White House here in this image. And then his body made the train trip to Canton, where there was a funeral again for him. And then he was put in the temporary receiving vault in Westlawn Cemetery, again, next door to our property, because his friends and advisors got together to talk about a suitable memorial for the slain president. And I was researching something else a while ago, and I found this article about a man who literally cried himself to death after McKinley had died. It was found impossible to control or assuage his guilt, and up to the hour of his dissolution, he wailed constantly. So that's dramatic. I can't say that most people probably had that dramatic of a response, but it certainly was a national tragedy, and everyone, there was mourning everywhere, black drapes throughout Canton. A lot of we have some campaign ribbons that are campaign ribbon on the front, and then you turn them over and they have a mourning ribbon that they added on the back. So what is McKinley's legacy? I did kind of allude to earlier that I think he fully expected that he would be laid to rest in his family plot with his parents and sisters and a brother, and where his young daughters were buried. But public opinion was not going to allow that to happen. And I think of him as being very humble and probably a little embarrassed about this huge memorial that is built to him. So it's built between 1905 and 1907, and it is finished and dedicated in September. Sadly, Ida passed away in May of that year, but she would have seen the construction on her way to visit him. She visited him almost daily. So from a presidential side, I think his biggest legacy is that his death led to the creation of the Secret Service. We did not have the Secret Service the way that we think of it today in McKinley's time. They had originally been founded to combat counterfeiting money during the Civil War. They had some brief kind of security for the president, only officially during the Spanish-American War. There was nothing that was set up to have something to continuously protect the president. So on the left is some notes that his private secretary, George Cortelyou, made from a meeting that he held about a month, a little bit less than a month after McKinley died, to say, we need to address this problem. If you were in your 40s, then you would have remembered 3 presidential assassinations, because there were 3 in 36 years. So that I always use that to kind of startle people into thinking how prevalent this had started to become. And even though they start talking about it in 1901, everybody can't get on the same page until 1907. And so in 1907, we get the founding of the Secret Service as we know it today. But personally, I think his legacy is just as strong, if not stronger. He is remembered today as a genuinely good guy. He had friends on both sides of the aisle. Even if you disagreed with him politically, you liked him personally. We know now that he's been re-examined by historians presently, and people look back and they think of him as being very deliberate. He's not impulsive. He's very thoughtful. He's calm. He's steady, even in times of great chaos and uncertainty. And I think one of the things that he should be remembered most for is really his moral character, his kindness, his integrity, his loyalty, and his devotion to his marriage and to his children. So that's another image of Katie on the left. And then on the right, that's actually Ida's crocheting bag that she had a picture of him in the bottom of it. So we have that in our collection, and it is on display. But when Ida died in May of 1907, this article appeared in June, and I think it's a fitting end to kind of wrap up how McKinley is viewed after his death. God had given it to Ida Saxton to be fitly mated. There were many beauties and virtues in the character of William McKinley. His career was abundantly fulfilled, and the crown of glory he wore with such consuming modesty was studded with jewels both rich and radiant. The soldier, the civilian, the man of affairs, and the party leader, but the rarest of all that shone in that priceless diadem was his devotion, simple, constant, unerring, to Ida.
Thank you so much, Kim, for that fascinating look at our 25th president. I have visited the tomb and walked those 108 steps. It is well worth the trip, and just definitely bring your walking shoes, though, as you climb them. So, wonderful presentation. Next, I'm pleased to welcome Ruth Horstman, who will be speaking about William Howard Taft. So Ruth Horstman is an education technician at the William Howard Taft National Historic Site in Cincinnati, Ohio, where she works with school groups and other community organizations. Ruth has worked for the National Park Service for 10 years. She earned her undergraduate in history and master's degree in public history, both from Northern Kentucky University. In her free time, Ruth enjoys creating historic clothing and camping with her family. And with that, Ruth, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Okay, well, we are just waiting for my slides to show up there.
We can see them.
No, folks, see my presentation. This worked when we tried it before we started.
Are you having a hard time advancing it, Ruth?
On my end, it's not even there.
Okay, we see it on our end.
Okay, well, let's see. Oh, there we go. Okay, it's there now.
Okay.
So,
do you want to try to move the slide forward just to make sure that you can advance it?
Yep, there we go. Perfect.
All right, great.
So we are going to talk about William Howard Taft and his presidential connections. My name is Ruth Horstman, and I am an education technician at the William Howard Taft Historic Site. And this is our site here in Cincinnati, Ohio. And this picture was taken today. On the right, you will see the yellow house, the brick house that William Howard Taft was born in on September 15th, 1857. And the lower building there on the left, that is our Taft Education Center. And in the foreground is our cherry tree. It is a descendant of the ones that Nellie Taft planted when she was First Lady. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But again, this picture was taken today. Oh, my lights went out. Sorry about that. And we are almost at full bloom here in Cincinnati. But before we get into the presidential connections, let me tell you why William Howard Taft is important. He is the only person in American history who was both president and Chief Justice of the United States. And this location here in Cincinnati is the only place that I'm aware of that commemorates his life and legacy. So we are going to talk about the presidential connections between William and a number of different presidents. We are going to start with Rutherford B. Hayes. So William's father is named Alfonso, and Hayes actually beats Alfonso for the Republican bid for governor of Ohio in early July of 1875. But by mid-July of that same year in 1875, Governor Hayes calls upon the Taft House here in Cincinnati. And a little bit later in August, Alfonso and William actually go to Marietta to listen to Hayes give some speeches there. Our next connection is James A. Garfield. On October 22nd of 1863, Brigadier General James A. Garfield has dinner here at the Taft House. I really doubt that William was at the table because he was only 6 years old when that dinner occurred. But a little bit later, once William is an adult, he does work on Garfield's presidential campaign after Grant didn't win another Republican nomination. Our next is, of course, Ulysses S. Grant. Again, William's father, he was on Grant's cabinet. First, he was Grant's Secretary of War, and then a few months later, he ended up transferring over to become Grant's Attorney General. And in a letter, William actually mentions spending an hour on the South Portico during Grant's presidency. So there's probably a good chance that William did meet Grant during his time there. In 1879, when William was 22 years old, he did attend a homecoming celebration when Grant returned to Ohio. Our next presidential connection is Benjamin Harrison. Harrison and Taft meet in August of 1889, and they talk about some positions that Harrison thinks that William would be good for. And in January of 1890, Harrison actually talks to William about becoming Solicitor General of the United States, and William ends up being sworn into that position in February of 1890. So, of course, that means that the Taft family moves to Washington, D.C., and both William and his wife, Nellie, attend a New Year's Eve reception at the White House. That would have been in 1891. And Benjamin Harrison appoints William to be a judge on the U.S. Circuit of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit Court, and that was run in Ohio. So, of course, William and his family come back to Cincinnati, and he served in that role until 1900. Our next presidential connection is William McKinley. So McKinley appointed William to be the head of the Second Philippine Commission, and ultimately that becomes to be known as the Taft Commission. And that ran from 1900 to 1901. And then in 1901, William becomes the civilian governor of the Philippine Islands. And he stays in that position until 1904, when he was appointed Secretary of War under Theodore Roosevelt. But while William is the civilian governor of the Philippines, he was in legislative power and limited executive power. He set up courts, he wrote legal codes, he organized civilian service, he set up elections for municipal boards, and the municipal board members, they were responsible for collecting taxes and maintaining municipal properties and undertaking certain construction projects that were needed there in the Philippine Islands. Our next presidential connection is Theodore Roosevelt. TR and Taft initially meet in April of 1890. At that point, Teddy was a member of the Civil Service Commission, and William was the Solicitor General. In 1904, Roosevelt appoints William to be his Secretary of War. And then after TR's term is over, TR helps get William nominated for the 1908 election as the Republican nominee. William ultimately ends up winning that 1908 election. In 1910, Taft appoints his friend TR to be the American representative to King Edward VII's funeral in Great Britain. There is a falling out between TR and Taft, and TR ends up running against Taft in the 1912 election, and both of those men lose to Woodrow Wilson. Ultimately, they do make up, and that was in 1819 at the Blackstone Hotel in Chicago. That was the last time these two men saw each other in person before TR dies in 1919, and William does attend his funeral. Our next presidential connection, here, I guess we should talk about this one first. This is Taft and TR at William's presidential inauguration, and that's there in front of the White House. Here we go. Now, our next presidential connection is Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson beats both Roosevelt and Taft in that 1912 election. And during Wilson's time there, he creates the National War Labor Board, and it was established to mediate labor disputes during World War I. And William serves on that labor board, and it was around from 1818 to 1819. And during that time, they heard 1,245 cases. And here we have a picture of, there we go, slow connection. We have the picture of Wilson and Taft together, and this would be at Wilson's inauguration. Our next presidential connection is Warren D. Harding. So after Harding became president, Taft and Harding meet in December of 1920, and it's to talk about Taft getting a position on the U.S. Supreme Court. And Taft comes right out and tells Harding that he's too old to start as an associate justice and work his way up. Taft came right out and said he wanted to start as Chief Justice for a couple of reasons. The first reason is 3 of the men he appointed to the Supreme Court when he was president were still there. And Taft felt that he would feel ill at ease to be their junior since he had appointed them during his presidency. And Taft believed that being a former president would help create a unified court in the eyes of the public. Oh, my lights went out again. Motion activated lights that I'm not moving. So on January 20th, 1921, Harding appoints William to the Supreme Court, and he was confirmed on the same day with a vote of 60-4, and he took the oath of office about 2 weeks later. We have a picture of Harding here with Taft. So you've got Taft there on the left, Harding is in the middle, and on the right, this is Robert Todd Lincoln. And this picture is from the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial. So that's going to lead us into our next connection. We're going to jump back in time, and this connection, of course, is with Abraham Lincoln. On February 9th, 1911, Congress passed legislation to create a Lincoln Memorial Commission to advise on a location in the construction of the Lincoln Memorial. Taft served as the chairperson for this Lincoln Memorial Commission. And he ends up as Chief Justice dedicating the Lincoln Memorial on March 30th, 1922. So here is another view of that dedication. You'll see William there in the center, looking out over all of the people gathered for that dedication. And of course, you have the reflection pond. And if you look really carefully, it's hard to see, but you can see the Washington Monument there on the far end of the reflecting pond. Our next connection is with Grover Cleveland. In March of 1896, Taft attends a session of the Supreme Court. And while William is in Washington, he meets with President Cleveland to talk about an appointment to the Supreme Court. Ultimately, that doesn't happen. But a few years later, in 1909, Taft does give a eulogy in honor of Grover Cleveland at Carnegie Hall in New York City. Our next president is Calvin Coolidge. So Coolidge was initially sworn in by his father in the Vermont home, but a formal oath of office was performed by Chief Justice Taft on August 2nd, 1923. We've got an image of that. So you can see Taft there on the left with his hand raised in his justice robes, and you can see Calvin Coolidge there on the right also with his hand raised. Our next presidential connection, of course, is Herbert Hoover. And again, Chief Justice Taft swears him in as president on March 4th, 1929. We have a picture of that. Again, you can see Taft there on the left in his justice robes and Hoover there on the right. So there ended up being 12 presidential connections between Taft and other presidents, either before or after they were president. But there's one other presidential connection that we're going to talk about. And of course, that would be his wife, Nellie Taft. So Nellie, her given name was Helen, but she was called Nellie. And this is going to tie us in to the connection between Nellie and William and music and entertainment in Washington. So Nellie actually graduates from the Cincinnati College of Music. Now we call it the Conservatory College of Music, and that's based out of the University of Cincinnati. So she was very interested in music, given that that was her formal education. Nellie co-founded the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra Association in 1893. And of course, the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra is still around and going strong. Well, while Nellie was in the White House, she music and female entertainers to entertain at the White House. Nellie planted the cherry trees around the tidal basin, and it is currently the Cherry Blossom Festival in DC. And it is said that William loved to dance, and he was actually light on his feet, considering he was a fairly large man. That is an interesting idea. So I have concluded what I'm going to talk about. I'm not sure if there are any questions for myself or for Kim. If anyone wants to put anything in the chat there, we can answer that.
All right. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ruth, for that in-depth look at the life and legacy of our 27th president. I love the format, these presidential connections. It's something we don't often think about. And they all are tied in some ways like this, descendants, members of their cabinet, Supreme Court appointments. So it's a really interesting way of looking at it. We do have some questions here, and let's see. I want to start. Let me go back here. Okay, there's one from Chris. It says, did the McKinleys have any surviving children? And are the 108 steps a significant number?
No, they did not have any surviving children. So that, our presidential library, we always say we have the largest collection of McKinley artifacts in the world, but it's much smaller than what you'll find at a lot of other presidential sites because he didn't have any direct descendants. So he died in 1901. Ida died in 1907. Our organization was founded in 1946, but we didn't have a building until 1963. So that's a lot of time. We're often jealous of you, Josh, at Hayes because of the immense amount of writings and things that you have. We don't have that. So no, he didn't have surviving children. So if anybody claims to be a McKinley descendant, it has to be from, as a niece or nephew or something like that. The 108 steps are no significance. My late husband, Chris, wrote a book about the monument. He made it his mission to try to find out why there are 108 steps. And we kind of concluded that that's the grade of the hill. And that was the architect's design. So people want it to mean 108 days, like in his second term, but that's not how many days there were in his second term. So there hasn't been any significance that we've seen.
All right. Thanks for that, Kim. Yeah, I always kind of jokingly, mentioned to my coworkers that, all the documents that we have from Hayes, it's kind of like job security. It's just a whole lot to read and go through. Let's see here. We have a question, another one for Kim here, and this one's from Mark. It says, some have characterized McKinley as an imperialist. Others have said that he is the first modern president. How would you respond to these two characterizations? Great question.
I think they're both true. You can't really look at what the result of the Spanish-American War was without kind of seeing it's rather imperialist. We have not had colonies or territories before. And what happens, especially in the Philippines, it's not a good story. There's an insurrection by the Philippine people. They sort of felt like they were handed off from Spain. They were fighting for their independence from Spain, and then they were sort of handed over to the United States, which was not what they wanted. And they weren't involved, nobody was involved in those talks or any of that agreement. So, that war was really bloody. 200,000 Filipinos died. There was over 4,000 Americans who died. It lasted into Teddy Roosevelt's term, would have been McKinley's term. So, I don't think you can make a case that he wouldn't be an imperialistic figure when you look at it that way. But he's also considered the first modern president for a variety of reasons. One being that, he's really using the executive branch is getting stronger. And it's kind of, he uses his position to kind of take control of a lot of things that his successors, starting right away with Teddy Roosevelt, is going to run away with that. And kind of centralizing power in a more modern sense in the 20th century. So, I think both of those things are absolutely true.
Let's see here. A question from Catherine, and this one is, can you say more about the evolution into the presidency for Taft? Some controversy with his nomination?
So, absolutely. So, William never wanted to be president. It was more that Nellie wanted to be first lady. So she really pushed William in that direction. And she had a lot of pull in William's career. That's why he turned down the 2 previous times or options for him to go to the Supreme Court, because Nellie knew that if he went to the Supreme Court, that was an appointment for life, and she never would have got to be first lady and make it to the White House. So she was kind of a pushing and pulling from the background, because of course she was not able to be in politics because women hadn't earned the right to vote at that point. Some controversy with his nomination. His first nomination, absolutely not. There was no question whatsoever. Roosevelt handpicked him, and everyone stood behind Roosevelt, and William easily got that. Now, his second nomination, I'm not going to say there was any controversy exactly, but the tradition of the time was that the person wanting to be nominated did not go to the conventions. You kind of elbowed your buddy and said, hey, put my name on the list. So William was not at that second Republican convention. He had his supporters putting his name up there. Well, Roosevelt broke that tradition and actually went to the convention himself and said, pick me, I want to be president again. And there was some scuffles. It got really ugly. There were fist fights. There was arrests. It was bad. It was very, very bad. Teddy was unhappy, and he basically said, fine, if you won't nominate me, I'll go start my own party. So all the Roosevelt supporters leave. So in our introductory film here at our site, it actually says William easily won the Republican nomination. Well, of course he did, because all the Roosevelt supporters were gone. So that's how the Bull Moose Party got started. That split the Republican Party, and that's how Wilson won that 1912 election. So no, I'm not really saying there's really any controversy. I know there's another question for me. Are all presidential museums part of the national park system? No, absolutely not. Kim's site is not part of the National Park Service at all. And some are run privately, some are run by states, some are run by the Park Service. Usually, I shouldn't say usually, some presidential libraries are run by the National Archives, which is a totally different federal organization.
Thanks, Ruth. And the Hayes is not either. We're not part of the federal system. Ruth, since we got you, we'll follow up. There's another question here from Mark again. It says, it's rare for people once they've been federal judges to go back to the executive branch. Why was Taft so highly regarded?
Taft was so highly regarded because, well, he started in the judicial branch, then he goes to the executive branch, and then goes back to the judicial branch. And Taft was so highly regarded because he did things by the book. He was a very strong believer in the Constitution and the enumerated powers listed in the Constitution. That was one of the differences between he and Roosevelt in the way that they regarded the Constitution, what was allowed to them in the enumerated powers. He was a good all-around guy. Very good at what he did. He was charismatic, even though he was not necessarily a good public speaker. He didn't always remember everybody's name, but he was not in it for glory. He wasn't in it to see what he could get out of it. He was in it to serve the American people, which is what he ended up doing for his entire adult career.
Excuse me, so everybody knows, you'll see again that I have dropped the link to all of these programs that are going to be on YouTube. So I believe the first two are up, and the third is not quite, but should be soon. And this fourth one will be up shortly as well. So if anybody would like to have a look at these and share them with a friend, there's the link below. This next question is for Kim. Greg says, thank you both. Kim, if I recall correctly, it was McKinley who was the first president to ride in a motor car that was steam powered, or was that Teddy Roosevelt?
I think it was McKinley. I want to say he talked about how fast it was going, and it was literally like 12 miles an hour. So yeah, he did ride in a car.
On that same note, William was actually the first president to have a car at the White House. So he converted the horse stables into a garage, and so he had the first motorcade.
Great context there. That's excellent. Let's see. Nathan says, this is an interesting question. Did McKinley or Taft ever comment on how so many presidents were born or raised in Ohio? Any circumstance where they spoke to why they felt so many executives came from the Buckeye State?
I don't know of any time that William ever spoke on that. I'm not sure.
I'm not sure either. That's an interesting question.
All right. Well, we'll have to do some further research on that, Nathan. Let's see. Mark says, would you say that McKinley and Taft had similar personalities? So I guess this is a question for both of you. Since McKinley came first, why don't you start with that, Kim?
Not knowing a whole lot about Taft, I'm not sure. From what Ruth has said tonight, it seems like you use some of the same terms that I would. That he was just a good guy, and a personable person. So I think so, I guess.
I'm going to follow up on that same thing with Kim. I don't really know much about McKinley. He's kind of not who I study. I mean, I spend my time with Taft, but I would say that, yeah, they probably do have similar personalities, and they were both dedicated to their families and to the American people.
One of the great things I think about this series is that we're seeing the experts look on these different presidents. So it's kind of fun because everybody can kind of make the decision on for their own on their own for that question. Sherry Hall from the Harding brought up a really good point. Someone asked about presidential rankings, and she said, I don't really take a whole lot of stock in that because no one is an expert on all the presidents, so it's hard to kind of look at them and put them in that order. So I thought that's a really good point because a lot of us have heard different things about the different presidents that we think we know, but a lot of the times these turn out to be not true, as we've learned with like William Henry Harrison's sickness, or Ida McKinley not being the invalid that of legend. So I think it's always important to keep that in mind. Let's see. Anne has a question. What was the reason for McKinley's parents/family move to Poland?
I think it was for the school system there that they moved. McKinley was the seventh of 9 children, so they had a very large family. And I believe that the reason that they moved to Poland was for the schools.
Okay. Let's see. Can you say, this is from Catherine, can you say more about relationship between photographer Benjamin Johnson and president? How did she get the gig?
Yeah, that's a great story because she moved to Washington, D.C. in the 1880s, and she took a photograph of Benjamin Harrison's father-in-law, and that got her into kind of the White House circle. So she took pictures of Harrison, Cleveland, McKinley, Roosevelt, and Taft. And so after Taft, she seems to have moved on to other interests. She doesn't take pictures of any presidents after that. But it was actually a presidential family member that got her kind of in the inner circle. And we have that photograph that we borrowed from the Benjamin Harrison site. So that's in the exhibition. It's mounted on the cardboard, and it has Francis's name in gold on the bottom. So it's kind of it's always neat to have, like, this is the artifact that did, let her into this circle, and here it is right here in this case. So in the exhibition, we have photographs. Her whole collection was given to the Library of Congress after her death. And I think one of the things that's been the most fun for me with this exhibition is that there were a lot of photographs that we had in our collection that we had gotten reproductions at some point from the Library of Congress, and her photography information got separated. So I'm looking at these pictures and I'm saying, I've been at this site for 25 years. I've seen that picture of Ida and that inaugural gown. I've seen that picture of, him tipping his hat to a photographer. But now we've been able to put all that back together for our collection to say, no, these are photographs that were taken by someone and we know who that is. And we want her name put back on everything in our collection. So if you're in the Canton area, that exhibit is up through the end of May, and it talks about all of your presidents. Not Hayes, I'm sorry. No, it's too soon.
I have a quick question I'm just going to throw in here for Ruth. I was wondering if you talk a little bit more about Taft's time in the Philippines. Did he write about his experience there? Did he keep, some journals, diaries, and things, or what were his thoughts on his time there?
He did write a lot about, he did have journals, he did have letters, and that's where most of our information comes from, the things that he was doing. He really enjoyed his time in the Philippines. He really wanted to help the Filipino people become independent, but they had been so suppressed by Spanish rule that he thought that it would be a while before they could really get their feet under them to learn how to be independent. He did some things. He did not like the way that the Catholic Church and the Pope owned so much land in the Philippines, and negotiated a contract to purchase land from the Vatican and the Pope. And then he goes back to the Philippines and sells it to the people there so they can become landowners and increase their wealth. William was liked much better than, of course, Arthur MacArthur, who was in charge of the first Philippine Commission. And that was during the Filipino-American War, when the Filipino people were rebelling against America being in charge. They're basically saying, we just got out of Spain and now have somebody else in charge of us. We do have people from the Philippines come here because William is still highly regarded in their country because he helped set them on the path to independence. Most American names are being removed from places in Manila and all around the Philippines, but William's name is still there. The main road through Manila is called Taft Avenue.
Thank you for that. Let's see. This one is back to Kim. How would you characterize McKinley's relationship with Teddy Roosevelt?
I would characterize it as he tolerated Teddy Roosevelt. No one expected Teddy Roosevelt to be president. They were kind of sticking him in what most people felt was a useless job as vice president, where he would kind of stay in his place. And of course, that's not at all what happened. So knowing the personalities of the two, I can't imagine that they would have been friends. I don't know that, their leadership styles were completely different. For as calm and steady as McKinley is, Teddy is blustery and, very loud, and we think of him as more of a modern president in a sense than McKinley. McKinley's kind of the last of the old guard. He's the last Civil War soldier to be president. And then Teddy is something completely different. So I really get the sense that it would have been very interesting to see what would have happened had they spent full 4 years together. And of course, McKinley wouldn't have been able to run anyway. So maybe Teddy would have ended up president in 1904. We don't know. But regardless, I don't think they probably thought too much. And I don't think they actually met too often. I think they only met a handful of times before the election. So it's a completely different idea from how, running mates today know each other well. They campaign together in a lot of ways. And that was not how that worked in 1900.
We have some folks dropping some comments in the chat. If anybody sees anything and wants to speak to that, that's great. Thanks for including these thoughts here. Let's see, we have another one for Kim. This is from Scott. This is kind of going right off of what you were just answering. Let me see here. It says, I have read that Roosevelt considered McKinley to be, somewhat of a Midwestern hayseed and didn't respect him. Have you found that to be true?
I think so. I mean, again, as Ruth said, I don't study Teddy Roosevelt. He wasn't too much of a part of McKinley's, life. And so I don't know a whole lot about him, but, I do think that his kind of Eastern Seaboard thinking is a little bit different from the way, he wanted to go to war. Everybody knows Teddy wanted to go to war. He was for the Rough Riders. He went to Cuba and was really anxious to fight in the Spanish-American War. Whereas McKinley, who had already been to war, was not interested in rushing into something like that. So Teddy's looking for something different than McKinley is. I think McKinley was sort of talked into being the presidential candidate in 1896. There's no talking Teddy into that. He wants it. He wants it badly. And so I think he probably would have looked at, from his perspective of being kind of very vocal and that kind of personality that's larger than life. I definitely think that he would have looked at McKinley's calm, reserved personality as being a hayseed from the Midwest. And I'm from New York, so I'm, I get it. But I think it was probably true.
See, not seeing.
Oh, and I do see, hold on. Yes, there were no official term limits in 1904. That is true. It was the precedent of not running for a third term. Sorry about that.
Let's see. I have one more question I want to ask. I don't see any more in the chat. Anybody that's here, please feel free to drop some more in. We technically had till 7:30 though. If we run out of questions, that's fine too. I wanted to ask Ruth, could you talk a little bit more about the schism with Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft?
Sure. So, okay, I guess, where should we start? So William was Teddy's Secretary of War. And when Roosevelt would leave the White House, he did not leave his vice president in charge. He would generally leave Taft in charge. He believed that Taft would keep everything together, and he did. So when Teddy kept his campaign promise to not seek a third presidential nomination, which would have been for 1908, he handpicked William to be his successor. So when William was a man of duty, and as long as TR was the boss, William basically did what he was told. Then when TR leaves office and William becomes the president, now William was in charge. And William had some different ideas about how the presidency should be run, particularly about, again, those enumerated powers that were in the Constitution. William was trained as a lawyer, and he was straight and narrow and followed the law. And he believed that what the Constitution said the president could do was all the power the president had. TR looked at it the opposite way by saying, well, the Constitution doesn't say I can't do this. So very different views on the Constitution. But there was, after William is in the White House, something happened. TR goes off to Africa for safari for a year. His brother Charlie, so William's brother Charlie, who really campaigned for him, helped with financing, and got him into the White House, left and came back to Cincinnati. And then the thing that was really the biggest blow to William was Nellie. Nellie had a pretty major stroke, and she had to convalesce, and she actually went to Connecticut. So here's William sitting in the White House by himself in a job he never really wanted. So he was just not happy with it at all. He was speaker that TR was, conferences and call the reporters in to pat himself on the back the way that TR did. So the public just didn't relate to William in the same way, because William just wanted to stand on his record. He did explain it, but it was another thing that caused split. It's the Ballinger and Pinchot controversy. So Pinchot was TR's man. Now this is some men working in Alaska, and Pinchot had been appointed by TR and was doling out some federal lands and things going on in Alaska. And Ballinger was Taft's man. So he gets up to Alaska and he starts looking through the books, and he sees some irregularities. And so these irregularities are brought back to Taft, and Taft sits down to look at it and says, yeah, this isn't good. So ultimately what he ends up doing is he ends up firing Pinchot, saying that Pinchot was responsible for these problems that were happening in Alaska. And that really made TR mad. And that was kind of the final break between the two of them, that split ultimately. There's another question here for me real quick, is my lights. Sorry, I have motion activated lights and I'm not moving enough. Can you talk about Taft's family the political legacy in Ohio? How many Tafts have been part of our government? So I always say that there were 6 consecutive generations of Tafts in government. I always start with William's grandfather, which would be Peter Rawson Taft I. He served in the House of Representatives. William's father, his political career was local, national, and international. Locally, he was on Cincinnati City Council. Nationally, of course, he was on President Grant's cabinet, and then internationally, he served in the Chester Arthur administration. Arthur gave him 2 ambassadorships. And then, of course, next you had William. William's oldest son, Robert, was a U.S. Senator from Ohio. Robert has a son named Robert, who is also a U.S. Senator from Ohio. And Robert has a son, again, named Robert, who was the governor of Ohio. And that's, of course, Bob Taft, 1999 to 2007. So I always say, in my professional opinion, there were 6 consecutive generations of Tafts in politics.
Great, thank you, Ruth. Let's see, I wanted to ask a quick question to Kim about McKinley and Hayes, just selfishly, because Hayes. I've heard, and I sort of want to clarify this too, because this is something I've heard that I don't have an actual information for. Did McKinley have a poor relationship with his father? I've heard that Hayes attending his wedding was more important than his own father.
You know, I don't really know that, honestly. I think his father, I mean, he strikes me as sort of a remote kind of figure. I don't know that they were particularly close. I don't know of any rift that they had. But I do know that he really did respect of Hayes so much, and they had a lot of correspondence. He asked a lot of advice of Hayes about where he should move to, and what he should do next, and that kind of thing. I don't think we have any of those types of letters in the historical record between him and his father. So I think that it would be accurate to say that based on what we know. But then again, there could be things that are unknown. The personal lives of these people aren't always left for us to kind of analyze, but we can definitely say that McKinley had high regard for Hayes and did value his opinion greatly.
Okay, thanks for indulging that. One more thing I want to ask you since I got you here. One thing I think is really interesting when you study McKinley is Mark Hanna's close relationship with him. Could you talk a little bit more about that, how he becomes involved in the political world with McKinley and how he carries through that with the presidency?
Yeah, McKinley, like I said, he was sort of convinced to run. I don't think he wasn't as reluctant, certainly, as Taft. He was honored and he was going to, serve his country in that way. But I think Hanna really had a hand in kind of shaping his idea that he should run and then made it happen. So Hanna is really the brains and the money behind this Front Porch Campaign that was such an amazing kind of machine at the way that it churned out. And then, Hanna is offered, McKinley offers Hanna a position in the cabinet and he turns it down because he wants to be a senator, and he runs for Senate and he wins. I think he died of something like malaria, not malaria or tuberculosis, something. He had a fairly standard death that happens in the 19th century. Typhoid. It was typhoid. So, I don't think McKinley could have become president without Mark Hanna's support, because he had the connections and he had the financing that made it happen. So he was kind of the mastermind. Not to say that McKinley was, a puppet of big business, because he wasn't. That was kind of, I think, the perception and sort of maybe a little bit of the fear, but that is not kind of how his presidency played out. And he was not he wasn't bought and paid for by these big businessmen. They got him elected, but then he served the people. So I think that's an important thing to kind of distinguish.
Okay, thanks for the clarification on that. Looks like Jeremiah has his hand up. Jeremiah, please feel free to go ahead and ask a question.
Thank you both for the great presentations tonight. Kim, you mentioned something I had a question on for you, and I was wondering if you could speak to it a little bit. I'm working with elementary and high school teachers in Birmingham, and when I read about the Front Porch Campaign, I really thought that would be a great way to have a speech for kids to analyze with those great photos you showed. I was wondering, with those photos, I've seen one similar, are there full speeches available that he gave, and do you have access to those?
Yes, we do. And they're actually, they're online. It's been digitized. There's a couple different volumes by month of, because what would happen is McKinley had approval of the remarks that so each delegation had a representative, and that person had to kind of reach out ahead of time and talk, what are you going to talk about? And then McKinley would edit things if he felt like he needed to. So then McKinley's responses are highly tailored to the interests of that particular group, whether they're from, a farming state or they're from the mining industry or whatever it is. All of that is documented. Like everything that everyone said is documented. And then the party would also send out the text of his speeches into newspapers, which would print it verbatim. So you have Brian like saying all these words and people trying to furiously, you're not going to have your, AI transcription, you're trying to report accurately what he's saying. But McKinley has 100% control over what he's saying because he's submitting it in a written form. So you can find that in newspapers, newspapers.com or Chronicling America, any of those sites that digitizes newspapers, you can find it there. But there are a few volumes of kind of the back and forth, which is really kind of interesting to look at as well, to see what the delegations say. And then it says things like, pause for applause. It's fun, to read. So yeah, all of that is definitely out there.
Is that on your website, Kim? You said some of those sources are digitized. I didn't know.
I think I want to say, I can't tell you exactly where I found them right off the top of my head. I feel like it could have been something as simple as Google Books, but if you want to send me an email, it's director@mckinleymuseum.org. I will find that. I downloaded it, so I can actually send it to you as a PDF as well.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I just dropped that in. Oh, thanks, Chris. Chris was on top of it there. Thank you so much. Looks like we got just a couple more questions. This one's interesting from Nathan. He says, as a high school educator, what is one fact about each president? So this is not every president, just the ones we're focusing on tonight. Let's see, each president and or event each leader was involved with that I should teach my students. Feel free to suggest something that isn't typically taught in the classroom. My students enjoy random or lesser known facts, don't they always? Ruth, I don't know if you want to start with this or if you want to let Kim start. I'll just kind of put that out there to both of you.
Sure, I'll go first. I just
Okay.
put 2 fun facts in the chat. I wasn't sure if we were going to get around to that question.
Okay.
My facts were, one, William had the last cow at the White House. Very odd. There's a great story about how the cow gets lost. It ends up in the stockyards in Chicago. The cow was quite a celebrity in itself, had its own train car wherever it traveled. And of course, the biggest fact is that Taft was the first president to use the Oval Office as an office. And then it's just continued since then. But to talk about an event that each leader was involved in. So you had the Brownsville affair, and TR really protected William from that. William kind of made the decision about, because this, of course, happened while he was Secretary of War. The Brownsville affair occurs when some military men, oh gosh, Nathan, that's a horrible thing to say. Sorry. But Taft ultimately decided who got in trouble for this situation that happened in Brownsville, Texas. So since William was going to go on to be president, TR kind of took the fall for that and protected William from the fallout of it. And I don't think Williams really ever connected with the Brownsville affair, even though he was definitely involved in it, just because TR took the fall for him.
Kim, anything you'd like
Go
to
ahead,
add
Kim,
about
your
McKinley?
McKinley did not have a cow, but he did have a parrot. The parrot's name was Washington Post. So that's kind of a fun fact. When we talk about presidential pets, he did have one, a little unconventional pet. But I think in terms of an event, you know, I hate to keep harping on the Spanish-American War, but, you know, as a history major and somebody that loved history in high school, I didn't learn almost anything about it. We call it, you know, Teddy Roosevelt called it a splendid little war, but it has such an important impact of, if you want to understand even today, our foreign policy, like what were we doing in Vietnam, like all of those types of things throughout the 20th century to now, you know, that really lays the groundwork for a big shift in how our country is going to relate to the world. You know, we're not isolationist anymore. We're not, you know, we're done. We've grown out of being a colony. We fought each other in the Civil War, but this next one that we have is a lot more significant than I think a lot of people understand. And I think one of the best things that I loved about my high school teacher was how he taught how things fit together, which I think is far more interesting than to say this battle took place at this date and it, you know, all that names, dates, and places history. That's boring to me even, and I do this for a living. I think it's all those movements and how it all, one movement shapes another, and how different eras, you know, flow into each other. That's what makes it interesting, and it's definitely about stories. It's not about memorizing a bunch of boring facts, because that's not a way to get people to be lifelong history interested people that are going to support museums like we work at. So, you know, you're laying the groundwork, so hopefully you're doing a really great job to make those kids want to be the museum supporters of tomorrow.
I think that's such an important distinction to make, Kim. That, you know, I mean, the context is everything. A lot of times with presidents, you hear about this president, and then people know some facts about them or some things, but you know, to tie them into their era and to show that, you know, tie with the past, the future, how they're actually fitting into their time period is so vital to giving people a broader understanding of what's going on in the United States at the time. Let's see. Mark has some. He says, let's see. Any evidence that McKinley regretted having TR as his VP?
Not that I can point to. It's more general feeling that I have. Again, I haven't looked too much into that part of it, But I don't really think he cared much for him. So, and I don't know exactly like what was the process. Is it the party that's saying, here you go, he's going to run with you? I mean, I'm not sure that, not to say that he couldn't ultimately refuse. I'm sure he could have, but I think he was probably persuaded, and he could have regretted it. I mean, I think the contrast between them is so great that it would stand to reason that he would have wanted somebody else to be there. He probably, he was very close with Garrett Hobart, and their wives were very close, and his temperament was, he's a forgettable vice president in history. So I think that's the kind of vice president that most presidents probably prefer. And having somebody who's kind of loud and out there while he's president is probably not what he wanted.
Well, it looks like we don't have any more questions in the chat. We're just about 5 minutes or so here from our time. So I guess I'll go ahead and wrap up here. I want to thank everyone so much for joining us this evening, and for all of our programs in this series, all of our attendees and all of our presenters. Kim and Ruth, thank you so much for the sensational programs tonight. A special thanks I want to say to Chris and Lacey, and also to Christy Weininger for moderating one of our programs, and of course to all our presenters in the series. We hope that you enjoyed these programs and learned a lot about Ohio's 8 remarkable presidents. As mentioned previously, all of these programs have been recorded and are or will be available on the America 250 Ohio YouTube page. And as you can see, again, I've dropped that link into the chat. So thanks again, everyone. We wish you all a very happy 250th and exciting ventures in history throughout this year and beyond. Take care, everyone.